Now on to the three models and their conclusion. The first model we presented was that the cell, the simplest cell, is as complex as a space station. And that was discussed in video 2.4. At this point, we don't have any numbers to compare, but we do have a general question. If we don't believe a space station can form from space dust, why think the more complex cell could form from chemicals? There's an analogy here. And if we don't believe one, then we shouldn't believe the other. Please go to video 2.4 to review the content. Then in video 3.6, we looked at the energy needs of the first cell. Cells need energy, and the first cell was no different. So we estimated the probability of the first, most simplest cell having its energy needs satisfied. In the best circumstances possible, with the most optimistic assumption, a simple cell's energy level arriving by chance has the same probability as picking an event from 35,714,285 universes. This is across all the time of the universes, all of the matter of the universes, at the fastest rate of change of the universes. A different analogy would be winning the Powerball 42 quadrillion, 328 trillion, 500 billion times in a row. This fails the nonsense detector. Please go to video 3.6 to review the content. Now, in that analysis, we excluded a bunch of things. Well, what was missing? First, we need to point out that energy needs to be added carefully at the right time. Let's say all of the chemicals were in the right place, and we needed to inject some energy into those chemicals because living things have a higher energy level than dead things. But we'd have to inject just the right amount of energy. It needs to be big enough to, jumpstart the cell, but it has to be small enough to avoid blowing up the cell back into atoms, right? Now, this energy needs to be added at the same time as all of the particular atomic elements are there, and the energy needs to be added simultaneously, create all the machines, the machine factories, and power plants we saw in the LEC analogy. They need to be created all at once and then wrapped within a chemical outer skin. This is how a cell needs to operate, right? It needs a membrane. It needs all of these different proteins, these machines and machine factories and ATP. It all has to be there or the cell dies. There's also impurities that will interrupt the life-creating chemical reactions. We ignored those. And lastly, there's not a lot of time from when the Earth's surface could support life and when life actually occurred. It's just 400 million years. It's a small amount of time, geologically speaking. Then in video 4.7, we looked at what are the information needs of the cell. We saw that biological systems are information systems with multiple codes, where a code translates from one symbol to another. We ignored all the other codes except the genetic codes. We found there were several codes. Doing our analysis, we found the human genome has about 3 billion base pairs in total, which is equivalent to 2.4 billion bits of used information. That's roughly the same amount of information as the first iPhone. Now that 2.4 billion bits of information needs to be error-free. The calculated probability of the used information arising by chance is 10 to the minus 722 million power. An equivalent probability requires 5,160,513 universes. But we only have one universe. This fails the nonsense detector. So what was missing when we looked at the information? Well, we said when one gene produces one protein, which is a central dogma, that's not true with a spliceosome. And so the information density is actually higher in DNA. We need to explain how the genetic code came to be. We built a communication model. In that communication model, there's an encoder and a decoder. And the encoder and decoder, they need to have their codes match. So codes can't change incrementally and out of sync. Codes must change in synchrony all at once. So the genetic code needs to explain this. We also need to explain all the other codes, how they came to be, and all their information. So there's a lot of information that was missing. So what's our conclusion from the three models? So the three models were the Lex space station argument by analogy, a scientific mathematical model based on energy, a scientific mathematical model based on information theory. Here's an important point that I never touched on, but I'll touch on now. The two scientific models are path independent. They only depend on the beginning state and the end state. The path from beginning to end is irrelevant. Why is this important? It's important because I found when you talk to people about this, you'll say, well, A happened and B happened and C happened. They go, hold on. What if D happened after B? And then suddenly you're off discussing something that's irrelevant, and you just, or maybe it's relevant, but you don't see how. And the power of the arguments, the power of the finding is diluted. In this case, we just care about what was the energy state before, what's the energy state after, and what's the probability of increasing that energy state. In the information case, we ask, what's the information you're starting with, which is 0? What's the information you need, which is, over 2 billion bits? And you don't care how that's actually arrived at. It's the fact that that is the end state that we're calculating against. As well, as we've just seen, each argument ignores many confounding factors that make undirected macroevolution more impossible. And we're not trending towards converging towards possibility. We're blasting out to where things become more and more impossible. Finally, the conclusion to our question, does evolution make sense? The answer is always, it depends. Undirected macroevolution does not make sense. Why? Because undirected macroevolution is false. The three models show that undirected macroevolution could not have happened. Again, let me state that. The three models show that undirected macroevolution could not have happened. However, directed macroevolution makes sense because it can explain the findings of the three models. In one of the modules, we talked about how hard it is to arrange balls that are numbered 1 through 10 in a bag, how to randomly select them and order them. Well, intelligence can do that in 5 seconds, which would take hundreds of thousands of years to do by chance. So directed macroevolution makes sense because it can explain the findings of the three models. If we just pick up our slide back from video 1.1, what types of macroevolution are there? There's 3 kinds of directed macroevolution. The first kind is you have directed selection. The second kind is you have directed mutation. And the third kind is you combine them. You have directed selection and directed mutation. The fourth kind of macroevolution we talked about was undirected macroevolution with chance selection and chance mutation. But that is no longer viable. So what do we do now? Well, directed macroevolution is the only alternative left. How that direction happened is not a scientific question. Let me repeat. How that direction happened is not a scientific question. We need to leave the answer to that question to philosophy, theology, and history. Science has no dog in this hunt. It is not capable of answering that question. And so, the scientist should set it aside.